We are doing a deep dive today into Maggie O'Farrell's novel, Hamnet. And if you're thinking this is just another biography of Shakespeare, you should think again. Our sources show this is an intense, really intimate meditation focused on his domestic world, specifically the devastating fallout from the death of his only son in 16th century England. The core of this really is Shakespeare's wife. O'Farrell calls her Agnes, though history mostly knows her as Anne Hathaway. And the novel just uses her story to explore this visceral landscape of grief. So what are the most important insights we need to get into right away?
Well, the core tension is that brutal clash between private pain and public art. What's so fascinating is how the book uses this dark historical connection. The names Hamnet and Hamlet were literally interchangeable in the records back then.
Yeah.
And he uses that to show how art tries to process loss, but, often just magnifies the pain for everyone left behind.
Right. And traditional accounts of Shakespeare's life, they tend to treat Anne Hathaway as a footnote. Just this older, slightly inconvenient wife he left behind in the countryside. This book just completely reframes that.
It absolutely does. Agnes is reconstructed as the imaginative center of the whole household.
Yeah.
She's a powerful herbal healer. She's incredibly insightful about people, deeply connected to nature. It's very deliberate, very powerful pushback against that old stereotype of her being, uninteresting.
And that really speaks to a larger movement in historical fiction today, doesn't it? This idea of using fiction to actively correct the record.
Precisely. This version of Agnes is a key example of fiction acting as a corrective to what scholars call androcentric archives.
Meaning records written by men about men.
Exactly. So when the sources are silent about the women who are clearly there, the novel steps in. It uses imagination to restore their agency, their intelligence, their emotional lives.
Which makes you wonder then, how far can a novelist ethically go in repairing that history when the sources are so thin? It's a really compelling argument for literary empathy.
It is. And if we shift from Agnes to the tragedy itself, the novel confronts that famous Hamnet-Hamlet speculation head-on. But it forces you to experience it not through the playwright's genius, but through the family's wound.
And this is where the personal and public just violently collide. The sources point to one moment that feels particularly crushing.
The whole book kind of builds toward this one truly heartbreaking realization. Agnes travels to London, and she finds a playbill for a new tragedy. And she sees her dead child's name, Hamnet, spelled a little differently as Hamlet, transformed from her private loss into a public spectacle for thousands of strangers.
Wow, that moment where your deepest personal sorrow becomes public entertainment, that just hits so hard. That tension between art and exploitation, it feels so relevant to our debates today about who gets to tell stories of trauma.
Absolutely. It raises that question. When does turning pain into art feel like an act of honoring? And when does it just cross the line into appropriation?
To really feel the weight of that loss, you have to zoom out and think about the context. The reality of child mortality, of the plague in the 16th century. Grief wasn't abstract, it was a physical threat.
The novel grounds this so well in the bond between the twins, Hamnet and Judith. Their connection just makes their vulnerability so stark. You see these children living under this structural precarity.
The constant threat.
Yes, the sheer uncertainty of survival when an epidemic could arrive on a flea. The book makes the speed of the illness so harrowing. Grief becomes this physical, devastating landscape.
The sources show the book is almost arguing that because the archives are so silent about the real Hamnet, all we have is a burial record, that carefully researched fiction can become a kind of secondary evidence.
Right, not factual evidence, but emotional evidence. Evidence for imagining the lived experience.
So we've explored reclaiming Agnes's story, the tension between grief and art, and how fiction and history can work together to fill in the past.
And that lived experience, it continues. The novel deliberately complicates things by focusing on the survival of Judith, the twin sister.
So it's not about resolution.
Not at all. It's about a permanently complicated, half-broken survival. The fact that they still had a daughter who lived means their grief existed right alongside this living, breathing connection to the boy they lost. So here's a final thought for you to take away. In what ways does Judith's survival, a twin who shares Hamnet's face and his memories, actually complicate rather than resolve the family's grief? And how does a novel like this help us imagine the interior lives of those who are left behind to carry that memory?